All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for spending your morning and your day with us today for this really important seminar. My name is Janet Hayes. For those of you who may not know who I am, and there are some apparently, and what Healing Minds NOLA is. Healing Minds NOLA is a nonprofit organization I began a couple of years ago to explore alternatives to incarceration, homelessness, and death, and create a full continuum of care, of psychiatric care in our communities in our state. So in doing research on how to do that, I came into contact with Treatment Advocacy Center, who happen to be experts at it. And one of the things that they do, and that really came out of Treatment Advocacy Center, is Assisted Outpatient Treatment, that really works for people, seriously mentally ill people, who have trouble complying with their treatment plan. So we were hearing from family members that maybe they have a loved one that they couldn't get help for, social workers who are constantly seeing the same people over and over and cannot get them into care, police officers who see the same people cycling in and out of in and out of jails, judges who are seeing a lot of domestic abuse cases, and same people cycling in and out, and they can't get them help because we don't have any laws that are being used that allow for us to assist people when they're most in need. And so in doing the research and coming into contact with Treatment Advocacy Center, there was a group of us that went up to Rockville, Maryland last summer to do the federal Assisted Outpatient Treatment implementation training that was hosted by SAMHSA and conducted by Brian Stettin and Lisa Daly, who I'm going to introduce to you in a little minute. And so from there, we decided that it would be really great if we could bring that training back to our own state. And so we decided that we would do a series of events to educate people about what AOT is, and then to move forward into how to implement AOT in regions where people wanted to start a program or a court. And that's where all of you come in. So through outreach, we reached out to folks, and we got a lot of feedback through surveys on what problems people see in terms of implementing AOT in their communities. What were the sticking points? What were the concerns? What were their thoughts, their comments, their suggestions? So Treatment Advocacy Center are going to address a lot of those concerns today. And feel free to ask questions throughout the presentations if you want to stop. Or we're going to have a larger discussion at the end, but if you have a burning question, there will be time for those questions to be answered. And so a lot of those concerns were funding, of course. How do we implement AOT if we don't have the capacity and the services and the resources to do it? What about the patient who won't come into court? So there's different ways that a person can be brought into a court. One is through step down from an inpatient hospital stay, a PEC. The other is through a caregiver or a concerned citizen, a social worker, a police officer who see that a person is really in need, but they can't get them into court because they haven't been PEC'd. So those concerns are also going to be addressed. So we started with part one of this series. We brought Judge Oscar Kazin from San Antonio, who began the first assisted outpatient treatment court there, which is now a national model. It took them 10 years to get to where they are. They see in that county about 4,500 cases a year, and they have a docket large enough to handle 80 cases at any time. So we don't have that here yet. It took them a while to get there. They started with what they had, and they built off of their successes. And so that is why it's now a national model. So Judge Kazin came in. We did a presentation in New Orleans, and we did one in Baton Rouge, which was attended by about 100 people altogether. And basically, it was just to get an idea of what a good AOT program looks like, or a model court would look like. We've never done that here. We have done ad hoc AOT orders that are often not successful because there's no team working together to ensure the success of the patient. That's where bringing in the judge matters. So the judges play a large role in this, and I'm so glad to see some of them here today. I don't want to talk for too much longer because we're a little late getting started. I'm going to ask Jan Kosevsky, who has been an amazing partner in all of this with us, Capital Area Human Services, in helping to get the word out. And then I'm going to introduce Lisa and Brian, our featured speakers, and ask for one of our sponsors to make a few remarks. So, Jan.
Okay, good morning. And when we talk about amazing, I think we need to definitely recognize the work that Janet Hayes has done to bring us all together so quickly to this point. So I just want to talk, I'll be very, very brief. Since 2008, Louisiana had an AOT law on the books that's been rarely utilized. This law was established to help people with a serious mental illness, a history of noncompliance, a person who within the past 36 months has been issued an emergency certificate and who is unlikely to survive safely in the community. Unfortunately, due to problems in the actual law here in Louisiana, people and family members in need of this intervention have not invoked it. But I do want to say that within really less than 3 months, many people have gotten together. Many people are in the room today who have worked on this, and I'd say that several groups that included mental health providers, members of the judiciary, advocates, family members, LDH lawyers, lawyers from mental health advocacy have worked hard to amend the existing law to ease its implementation and therefore serve many people with a serious mental illness as intended. And I just want to mention, I think that most of you in the room are aware of what's brought us here, the history that's gotten us to this point where we have people with such serious mental illness who are in the community and are not being made available or the services that they need. We were never set up as a community mental health center to deal with the types of services, the intensity that people really need at this point due to deinstitutionalization and many of the other factors that you're aware of. So basically, the groups that I mentioned have gotten together to review the law, and I want to just make note, Judge Johnson from the 19th Judiciary, just want to shout out to him because he really kind of pushed us here in the greater Baton Rouge area. And it was the work that the group that I've already mentioned, along with him, and really statewide, the human service districts, all 10 of them, everybody was involved with making comments. Will the executive directors of the human service districts or board members please raise their hand and be recognized? So thank you, I really appreciate that. You, along with folks across the state, have had comment on basically editing the law that exists and making it more useful. So I did want to let you know that the amended bill that you all have signed off on was given to Senator Regina Barrow from East Baton Rouge Parish, and that she is looking to submit it as a bill this year to be put into law to make the amendments that we feel will make this law really serve people. So today we're going to be hearing from national experts on the utility and the outcomes in states with functional AOT laws, and then we're going to be wrapping up with the 10 local human service districts on how we are going to implement this law based on the changes that we feel will make it more accessible to the people in need. I guess the bottom line is with me, and I know most everybody in this room, I hope and believe, is the bottom line is that families will be served better. People with serious mental illness will be served better. We'll have less homelessness, less incarcerations, less people being sick and really left on their own when there are services available to them that they need to access. So I'm keeping it very brief. I'd love to talk more, but there are so many people here that have more knowledge and experience than me. So we'll go ahead and let Janet come back and we'll move it on. But just basically, thank you for all the work that you've done to make amendments to the law so that hopefully this session it will come out amended and we'll be able to use it.
Thank you so much, Jan. Just a couple of to-dos before we get started. So the Wi-Fi password, if anybody needs it, just disappeared off the screen. But we have some tired travelers anxious to get started. So glad that Brian could be here today and after bad weather yesterday in Texas. And so he's been doing a yeoman's job of getting himself here so that he can present this to you all today. So Speaking of Brian, Brian is the Treatment Advocacy Center's Policy Director. In 1999, as an Assistant New York State Attorney General, Brian was instrumental in conceiving and drafting Kendra's Law, landmark legislation establishing assisted outpatient treatment in New York. After leaving the Attorney General's office in 2007, Brian served as special counsel to the New York State Commissioner of Criminal Justice Services and counsel to the Health Committee of the New York Assembly. Since joining the Treatment Advocacy Center in 2009, Brian has worked with state legislators and policymakers across the U.S. to improve mental health commitment laws and establish AOT programs. Brian is a 1991 graduate of the City College of New York and a 1995 graduate of the University of Texas School of Law. Lisa Daly is our other featured speaker today. Lisa is Legislative and Policy Counsel at the Treatment Advocacy Center. Lisa advocates for improvements in state civil commitment laws, increased funding for mental health systems, and better laws and policies on discrimination. She brings many years of policy and advocacy experience at various nonprofit organizations. Prior to joining the Treatment Advocacy Center, Lisa represented refugees seeking asylum in the United States from Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America. She also has many years of experience as a litigator in the areas of human rights and civil liberties. Lisa received her master's levels law degree from the University of Oxford in the UK, her Juris Doctorate from Hamlin University School of Law, and bachelor's degrees in psychology and English from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. And by the way, you all should have materials, but if you're missing anything, you can pick them up from the registration desk or from John Nosaka, who happens to be standing at the door. Lisa also has her business cards out on the table, so if anybody would like materials after the conference is over, please feel free to email, and she will be giving you more information about that. And again, I just really want to thank everyone and our sponsors for helping for us to put this together. Special mention to John Nosaka, Marianne Mason Donovan Mason, Mason Donovan, and Jan Kotsovsky, and too many to mention, really, who really rose to the occasion and made this happen. So, but very special thanks to our sponsors, ComCare, Baptist Communities Ministries, Healthy Blue, Amera Health Caritas, Louisiana, and which one am I forgetting, y'all? Should never forget a sponsor. Ourselves, Capital Area Human Services District, or Services, and who am I forgetting? I guess that's everybody. And the Downtown Development District. Thank you, Barbara, because they were also very helpful in putting this together and part of the team, so it's always easiest to forget those closest to you. No, everyone has been wonderful. But I wanted to introduce Lisa Gardner from ComCare and invite her up to say a brief word before we get started, and then we'll go.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Janet, and thank you to all of you. ComCare is a Louisiana-based nonprofit. We operate 12 skilled nursing and rehab facilities throughout Louisiana and a hospice, and we serve about 1,200 seniors. Mental health issues do not discriminate. They reach across economic lines, they reach across rural and urban lines, and they affect the young and the old. Repercussions include crime, addiction, domestic violence, and what we see, elder abuse, elder neglect, and healthcare issues. So ComCare is pleased to be able to sponsor this, and we know that our humble sponsorship will have a ripple effect through each and every one of you on making a difference in the lives of people here in Louisiana. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, everybody. Good morning. I'm Brian Stettin. I'm the Policy Director for the Treatment Advocacy Center. Huge thrill to be here. So grateful, gratified that so many people came out today to learn about this concept of assisted outpatient treatment, and hopefully we'll put our heads together in the course of the day and figure out how we're going to actually get this up and running across Louisiana, at least starting in a couple of your major cities. I'll tell you a little about myself. So I'm an attorney. I worked for years on this issue as an assistant attorney general in New York, worked on ways to improve mental health services there. In the process of that, I connected with the organization I work for now, the Treatment Advocacy Center. And after about a decade of my government career, I wound up having the honor of getting to come to work for TAC. But you know, we are essentially an organization that works to remove legal barriers to the treatment of severe mental illness, which exist in many forms. And what this concept of assisted outpatient treatment, AOT, that we're here to promote and talk about today is one of the major things that we champion as an organization around the country. But you know, traditionally, and for the purposes that the organization was created for, that was essentially a matter of getting laws created in states, because we had a situation at that time, about 18 years ago, when most states did not have any mechanism under their state law to actually make it possible to court order a person to receive treatment on an outpatient basis, only on an inpatient basis. And so our organization's role has mainly been working with state legislatures, lobbying, helping build grassroots support for the fact that this should be on the books. And we had a tremendous success in that. We've now reached the point where there's only 4 states left that don't have any law like this. But I would also be dishonest with you if I didn't admit that some of those victories have been hollow. And you know, as Jan mentioned, Louisiana is a pretty good example of that, where we actually got a law passed in 2008. And as with in many states, the law gets passed with lots of fanfare and you know, an emotional signing by the governor, and everybody's excited, and then things just sort of go quiet, and this tool is there on the books, and not a whole lot of use is made of it. And so recognizing that and sort of having a gut check moment about that fact, we have really kind of shifted our focus in the last few years more towards implementation and working with not so much legislatures and legislators, because I think we've been, you know, pretty successful on that front, but the second part of that is connecting with folks like you who are actually working in the mental health system, stakeholders in your community's mental health systems, to actually get these programs built and use the authority that has been placed on the books through these laws. So obviously an opportunity to do that is something I really appreciate, and makes me, as I say, very glad to be here. So Lisa, just starting at this point, with this presentation, I want to let you know what AOT is and just clear up any mystification there may be at exactly what it is we are talking about, what this tool of assisted outpatient treatment is intended to do and what it consists of. And I want to start by making really clear that we are not suggesting that this is a cure-all for everything that's dysfunctional about public mental health, right? Those of you who work in these systems know that these systems are challenged, and one might even say in crisis, for a lot of reasons and in a lot of ways. And you know, if we were to go around the room and try and add to this little list I made here, we'd probably be here all day. But I just ticked off a few kind of major issues that plague public mental health. And again, we're not here to tell you that AOT is going to magically solve all this stuff. This is a tool in the toolkit about addressing one particular problem, and I think that it will have some residual effects on some of these other problems. But you know, this is no magic bullet. This is no cure-all. But when you look at what I see as sort of the biggest issues that you all are facing as you try to provide good care to people in the public mental health system, obviously at the top of any list like that, you've got to acknowledge that we need much more investment in public mental health, that we have shamefully underfunded our community mental health systems, that we have a severe shortage of inpatient psychiatric beds, so that if you're in a situation where someone is clearly in need of inpatient care, is in crisis, it's often very hard to find a place to put that individual. Beds are occupied by people in the forensic system who their law is required to treat, and leaves very few left for people to be committed civilly. And of course, when you are able to get somebody into bed, often they don't get to stay long enough as they might need from a clinical point of view to be stable enough to go back to the community. We have severe shortages, especially in rural areas, of people who are actually willing to work and able to work in the public mental health system. Access to psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses and other kinds of professionals is woefully inadequate in many places. We have a great need for new strategies in the law enforcement community to develop new ways to divert people and actually implement some of the good ideas we have out there to keep people from winding up in jails and prisons when they act out in the community in a way that's driven by mental health crisis. So all these are issues and all these are problems, and I would never suggest to you that implementing AOT in your community is going to make all this stuff go away. AOT is really designed to address one particular issue that plagues and vexes public mental health, and it's the last one I've put on the list. I've highlighted it in yellow, and that is this specific problem that I don't think gets really talked about enough, but it's not one that those of you who deal with people with severe mental illness are very familiar with. It is the particular problem of treatment non-engagement, right? The fact that even in the situations where you actually are able to line up services for somebody, many times people with severe mental illness will not avail themselves of those services, will not fully adhere to the treatment that is prescribed and developed for them because of aspects of their illness and aspects of their life situation that makes it hard for them to actually engage in that treatment. So, of course, this particular problem exacerbates all these others I've listed, right? Because what it does is it creates a class of people who, because they're so difficult to treat, are consuming a disproportionate share of resources. If you could advance, Lisa. And what we're talking about here is folks with severe mental illness, a subset of people with severe mental illness, by no means all, who are, as we say, caught in these revolving doors, right? Caught in the revolving doors of the criminal justice system and the mental health system, who we're seeing again and again cycling in and out of treatment. And a huge contribution to that problem is the fact that when they are returned to the community, they have so much trouble engaging in what is made available to them. Lisa? So let's talk just a little bit about what some of these consequences of treatment non-engagement are. I thought I had it working. Oh, yeah, there we go. I'm good. Yeah. No, it's the right, left and right. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the consequences of non-engagement with treatment, why this is such a severe issue for the system. One of them I think we want to speak about in a very delicate, careful way, but I think it's very important for us to acknowledge, and that is violence and crime. The reason I say we want to be sensitive about it, as all of us who work in the mental health field understand, is we want to be very careful here not to perpetuate stigma. You know, people with severe mental illness have enough difficulty and challenges with what they're going through that we don't want to make that worse by having the public be afraid of them unnecessarily and without any real justification. And so we're often reminding people, especially when we do any kind of public appearances or talking in the media, that people with severe mental illness are on average no more likely to commit violence or crime than the general public. And there is truth to that as a general matter. And it's something we need to keep repeating because, as I say, we don't want to contribute to stigma. But there is another reality behind that reality that I think we ignore at our own peril and really have to face up to. You know, when we talk about people with mental illness in general, that's a really vast category. You know, it's estimated 1 in 4 of us have a mental illness of some kind. And that includes lots of diagnoses that no one is likely ever to associate with violence or crime, right? Things like OCD and depression tend to make people address themselves in an inward way. And so that's really very different from the most severe conditions, things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which put you in an alternate reality and lead to delusion and psychosis. But even when we're talking about people with the most severe mental illnesses, the research shows that generally those are not risk factors for violence and crime. And the reason for that is that we know that treatment works. Excuse me. Most people with severe mental illness at any given day are in fact receiving treatment for that. And we have reams of data that tell us that with treatment, any propensity towards violence and crime is alleviated. But when we drill down to that subset of the subset, right, folks who with the most severe mental illnesses who are not receiving treatment, untreated severe mental illness absolutely is a risk factor for violence and crime. And you'll never find a study that tells you otherwise. And again, it's something we need as professionals and people who care about this issue to face up to. In fact, untreated severe mental illness is estimated to be a factor in about 10% of U.S. homicides, so that's, again, by no means the majority of homicides, but far disproportionate to the share of the population we're talking about, which is between 2 and 4%. And of course, more commonly, untreated severe mental illness leads to more kind of everyday crimes, things that people do sometimes to obtain the drugs they need to self-medicate, assaults, property crimes, various kinds of drug crimes, etc. Absolutely, untreated severe mental illness is a contributor to that. Another consequence of this lack of engagement that some people with severe mental illness suffer with is frequent hospitalization. And as we all know, under the laws of every state, when you have somebody in a psychiatric crisis, there is an opportunity to admit that person to a hospital, and hopefully that's what's going to happen in that situation. But when the person is stabilized, they have, and they reach the point where they are no longer a danger to themselves or others, as that's defined under a particular state's law, that individual has a right to be right back out into the community. But when you have not addressed that difficulty with treatment, non-adherence that led to that hospitalization in the first place, you put that person back out in the community just because they're stable for the time being, it is almost inevitable that you're going to see that person again because the cycle is going to repeat itself. And so that's why we see individuals that rack up this staggering number of hospitalizations over a period of years. And to me, the most tragic aspect of that is the toll it's taking on these individuals' brains, right? We know that each successive psychotic break that a person goes through, it's putting mileage on the brain, right? It's putting the prospect of recovery further out of reach. So we are really dooming people by allowing them to suffer psychotic break after psychotic break. We are dooming them to not have the opportunity to live the life they might be able to lead, that they might choose for themselves, were we able to consistently engage them in treatment. And you know, of course, even if you want to be completely cold-hearted about this issue and problem and not really look at it in terms of the tragic human consequences, if you are just focused on the bottom line, even then you have to acknowledge that treatment on engagement is leading us to a point of crisis, because the fact is that these interventions that we're talking about here, right, arresting people and prosecuting people and incarcerating people and hospitalizing people again and again, these are all enormously expensive interventions, right? These are all picking up the pieces of crisis, and that ain't cheap. And so it is fair to say that these people who are caught in the revolving door of the mental health and criminal justice systems are really stressing both systems fiscally beyond the breaking point and making it very difficult for those systems to serve the broader population of folks who they were designed to serve. So what is this about, this problem of treatment non-engagement? I would never want to oversimplify about it. It's about a lot of things. There are many reasons why some people, this subset of a subset, have difficulty engaging in the treatment that's made available to them. And again, I've ticked off a bunch here, and I'm sure we could probably add to this list. The fact that we don't have enough resources out in communities is often a contributing factor, a significant contributing factor to why people aren't engaging in services. Gaps in health insurance, the fact that some people have to travel long distances to meet with a provider, the fact that people are exacerbating their problems through substance abuse and creating addictions that make it even more difficult to engage with the treatment they're supposed to be receiving. The fact that sometimes medications have side effects that people don't like and might have pretty good reasons for not wanting to engage in the treatment that's been prescribed from them. Just general problems with executive functioning that some people with severe mental illness experience. When you've got to follow a treatment regimen and take a certain medication each day and be at certain places for appointments, that's very hard to do in combination with severe mental illness for many individuals. There is mistrust of doctors, and sometimes there is some experiences that people have had in their lives that form the basis of that. So there are plenty of good reasons and understandable reasons why people disengage with treatment. But there's one that I think doesn't receive enough attention, and as I'm about to show you from some of the evidence we have, is probably the one we ought to be paying the most attention to in terms of crafting policy. And that is the issue of anosognosia, lack of insight, a neurological syndrome that accompanies severe mental illness, not for all individuals, but for many. This is a symptom of brain dysfunction that can be simply described as the inability to recognize that you have an illness, right? As painfully obvious it may be to all the people around you that you have a particular illness, a person with anosognosia in combination with that illness is completely unaware of it. They cannot see it. They have a blind spot to that reality, however obvious it may be to us. This is often mistaken for denial, right? People will say, my son is very frustrating, he's in denial about his severe mental illness. I think it's really important for us to understand that this is not denial. There's a very significant difference in what we're talking about here. You know, denial is a universal human defense mechanism. It's something we all practice from time to time when there is some particularly painful reality in your life that you actually know is true. You're aware of it, but you have reasons for not wanting to admit it to yourself, and so you sort of stifle it. And maybe with the help of a good friend or a professional, you can sort of coax that reality to the surface and acknowledge it and face it and move on and you know, improve your own mental health. That's not what's going on with people with severe mental illness. They don't know the truth deep down, right? That reality is just not there for them at all. It is about dysfunction of the brain. And for a person with anosognosia, they simply cannot see the reality that they have an illness. And from that point of view, I mean, once we understand that the person with anosognosia is certain to their core that they are not ill, and now they're being told that you've got to take this treatment, and this treatment is going to have some side effects you won't like, and it's going to be a hassle and a huge drag on the lifestyle you envision for yourself. You know, from that point of view, of course they're not going to want to take their meds, right? It's perfectly logical because they're not seeing that it solves a problem that they can see that they have. And I think we have to keep that in mind at all times. This is nothing I'm saying here is about blaming or demonizing people with severe mental illness. We need to respect where they're coming from and not be as tempting as it is, natural as it is to be frustrated with somebody who just cannot see that they have a need for treatment. We have to avoid that temptation to be frustrated with the individual. Instead, we have to think in policy terms about what can we do to overcome this, to override this natural tendency of this individual to not want treatment. And just to sort of drive home that this is a medical condition, a physical condition about dysfunction of an organ of the body, no different than some other dysfunction any of us might experience with some other organ of our bodies. Here we're looking at brain scans of two individuals with schizophrenia. And again, anosognosia does not plague everyone with severe mental illness. So here you're looking at the brain of a person who has insight, recognizes that they are ill, comparing that with the brain of a person who does not, at a moment when they are being asked to perform a self-reflective activity. And what you can see pretty clearly here, through those kind of orange and yellow spots, is that there is brain activity happening, right, for the person who has insight that just isn't happening for the other, right? Synapses are firing in one person's brain that are not firing in the others. And this is not in anyone's control. Whether you're going to be the person unlucky enough to lack insight is not something you can will yourself to overcome. So as I say, anosognosia is not the only cause of non-engagement with treatment. It's one of many. But a particular study that I like to reference to make the point that this is one that we really need to pay attention to as policymakers and mental health professionals if we want to do something to overcome treatment non-engagement. A study published in 2006 in the journal Psychiatric Services where they looked at about 300 psychiatric patients who had chronic issues with non-adherence to treatment. And they started with baseline interviews to determine what portion of this group actually seemed to lack insight, actually seemed to be certain that they did not have an illness. And they actually found most of the people in this cohort of 300 had insight, did recognize to some extent that they had an illness. It was only about a third that were found to completely lack insight and be insistent that they were not ill. Excuse me. So I think that really kind of brings to light the fact that there's lots of things going on here that are causing non-adherence to treatment, right? But when these patients were tracked over time, there was a huge correlation between that third of the sample, right, those who had anosognosia, and the severity of the outcomes that they suffered as a result of their treatment non-engagement. So that very third of the sample were found to suffer over the time they were tracked significantly longer episodes of non-adherence to treatment. That was the group that was found more likely to completely stop taking their meds as opposed to, missing them occasionally or tapering off. The group most likely to have severe symptoms, the most likely group to be hospitalized. So this is a group we really need to pay attention to address this larger issue in a meaningful way. And this kind of brings me to what I call my bottom line on anosognosia, and here I like to invoke that corny movie, Field of Dreams, no pun intended. And those of you who have seen the movie remember that iconic line, right? If you build it, they will come. And there's a lot of people who say that very thing about the public mental health system, that the problem that we suffer from is simply that we are under-resourced, that we need to do a much better job of making sure treatment is available to people who want it in the appropriate forms that takes, and that if we were to solve that problem, all these people who were disengaged with treatment would come out of the woodwork, would come to the surface and be engaged in treatment. And, I'm not comfortable positing myself as the opponent of people who feel that way, because for the most part, I actually agree with them. It's shameful how little resources we have in our public mental health system. It is despicable that we have people who want treatment and can't get it. And there's no question that if we did a better job of resourcing, that there are lots of people not getting help now who would be helped. But there's another reality we have to acknowledge, because when we talk about this subset of the subset, right, those folks who are untreated because of their lack of insight, common sense tells us that building the system is not enough, right? If you build it, they still won't come because they don't see that this great package, an array of services you've lined up for them, has anything to offer them. They don't see that they have a problem that you are helping them solve. So by all means, I'm with the folks who say let's build that system. It's something else we have to do in addition to the thing I'm here to talk about today. But at the same time, recognize that we have to do something more than that for this particularly challenging subset of people who lack insight. So build the system, and let's do something else to help people who lack insight to engage with that system. And that's where this concept of assisted outpatient treatment comes into play. So this is a legal strategy that has been developed to address treatment non-adherence. It is a form of civil commitment. We're all familiar with the idea of civil commitment to inpatient care, a person who is in psychiatric crisis at a given moment. Even if they don't understand their need to go to a hospital, we are willing to say to that person, well, we have decided that the hospital is the place you need to be, that treatment is something you need to receive, and so we are going to confine you in a hospital until that crisis is addressed. This is something very different. This is a form of civil commitment for people who are not currently in crisis, but have a history of winding up in crisis because of their difficulty engaging with treatment. And they may be in crisis now, but it doesn't rise to the level where they need to be hospitalized. And so what we are saying with assisted outpatient treatment, or as it's otherwise known, outpatient commitment, is that we are going to commit this person to follow an outpatient plan in the community. We are going to develop a treatment plan that will allow this person to remain safely in the community, not need to go to a hospital. And because of this person's history of not engaging with that kind of treatment on a voluntary basis, we are going to court order it and say to the individual, this is something that we as a society are going to insist that you take part in, whether you understand your need to do so or not. And what we are trying to do here is leverage the power of the courts to influence behavior. We are using this legal mechanism in the hopes that it will change the way people act once they return back to the community, and we'll talk a lot today about whether the reality of that is borne out. But let's start by just speaking frankly about this court order that I'm talking about. As court orders go, when you look at your AOT laws around the country, they are uniquely toothless. They are not court orders that carry any kind of sanction or punishment when they are violated. You know, typically in the law, when we talk about court orders and why they work and why they have any reason to exist, we are relying on this power of the court to hold someone in contempt for not obeying the order. And if you are held in contempt of court, that could lead to you going to jail until you agree to stop showing contempt of the court. It could lead to fines piling up on you on a daily basis. And we are basically trying to scare a person in their hopes of not wanting to deal with those consequences into acting in the way that the court has insisted upon. Those kinds of sanctions would make no sense whatsoever in addressing this particular population, right? We're trying to create a pathway out of jail for people. We are not trying to find a creative way to send people to jail, hold them in contempt for not following a treatment plan, therefore we're going to put you in jail. I mean, that would completely undermine everything we're trying to accomplish. So it would make no sense to attach that kind of scare mechanism to this particular court order. So most of our state laws actually say explicitly that you cannot hold somebody in contempt for violating this particular court order. The other thing that you can't do in consequence of somebody violating this and not following their treatment plan, you can't say, well, that means automatically we're going to return you to the hospital. Once you're getting into that kind of deprivation of liberty, right, where you're saying a person has to be confined to a hospital, you can only do that if you find the person at that moment to be dangerous to themselves or others. A person who's not currently dangerous has a constitutional right to be in the community, and violating your treatment plan without showing signs of dangerousness cannot itself lead to commitment to a hospital. We are not going to use this court order as a basis to forcibly administer meds to somebody where we're going to strap them down and actually inject them against their will with a medication they don't want. That is something, forcible administration of medication is something that takes place in a hospital environment under certain conditions when you have a showing that a person at that moment lacks the capacity to make their own treatment decisions. It's unfortunately, as a last resort, necessary sometimes for people who are hospitalized, but that finding of lacking capacity is not part of what you have to show to put somebody under AOT. You wouldn't want to, because it would make it too narrow a circumstance where you could actually use the law, and a person who is in that kind of situation probably needs to be in a hospital anyway, not the community. So this order is not going to be the basis of that particular remedy. So many folks look at this, particularly judges who are having this concept explained to them for the first time, and they see in particular that they don't have contempt power to enforce it, and they sort of throw up their hands and write off this idea and say, well, what is the point? You know, if it doesn't have any quote-unquote teeth, what am I accomplishing by putting someone under this court order? And that's a fair question to ask and deserves a good answer. In fact, from our point of view, and I think the research that we'll talk about later today bears it out, there are a couple of really good points, the objectives that are achieved by placing someone even under a court order without a whole lot of legal effect. First one is something we call the black robe effect. And that is simply the concept that being told to do something by a judge is meaningful to people. That we all are inculcated as members of this society to respect judges as authority figures, to take seriously the process of being brought to court and the solemnity of a court procedure where you go through a hearing and the judge is up there listening to both sides and acting as an independent arbiter of the facts and making a determination this is something you need to do, and making eye contact with you and explaining that this is something that as a judge he or she is expecting of you. That has an impact on people in a way that being told by your mom or your doctor that you got to take your meds simply doesn't. And I don't want to oversell it. I'm not suggesting that everyone is impacted by this. There are people who don't care what anyone says to them, and even a judge, it just won't have an impact. And there will be people for whom you attempt to use AOT, and even that doesn't work. You don't reach them. I'm not suggesting this works with everyone, but I think the research is pretty clear. It works with a lot of people. So the fact that this tool is not so perfect that it's going to save everyone you would wish it would is obviously not a reason not to try it if we think it is going to have an impact on some individuals. And this is a very powerful piece of what AOT is about, and we're going to talk a lot more about how we reinforce it and make it as meaningful as possible. But what we're saying here is that we're sort of relying on the judge and the fact that a person's going to have to come back to see a judge repeatedly as the primary motivator for them, the thing that's different in their life than it was before, for them to stay on that treatment plan that's been prescribed for them. And I should also point out that this black robe effect, none of us are immune from it. It has an impact on the treatment system too. So we all know there are many cases where providers in the community are falling down on their responsibilities to the people they're supposed to be serving, and being told by a judge as a provider, okay, I am incorporating this treatment plan that you've asked me for into the court order. I'm expecting this person to adhere to these services, but I'm also expecting these services to be delivered to this person by you, the system, and the individuals who make up that system. And when we come back to court for a status hearing, I'm going to expect to hear from you guys that you're doing your part by this individual. That has an impact on all of us, and no one wants to go back before a judge and have to tell the judge, I screwed up. So this is very much a two-way commitment. As much as we're committing the patient to the system, we're committing the system to the patient. That's the theory behind this anyway. Second point, second thing we're accomplishing by placing people under an AOT court order is that we are facilitating a rapid response in the event that the person does not follow their treatment plan and begins to move down that road towards becoming dangerous to themselves or others. And I want to make very clear here that when I spoke a minute ago about the fact that there is no punishment attached to violating an AOT order, that is not to say that there is no consequence attached to violating an AOT order. There absolutely has to be a consequence. There has to be something that happens. And if there isn't, if a person gets a sense that it's really completely meaningless and if I violate the order, it won't be any different for me than it would have been without the court order in place. Once people in your system start to get that message, then the whole thing really does break down and have no particular impact. So what is this consequence? What is supposed to happen? Lisa will talk more about Nicola's Law and about how this is facilitated specifically under your statute in Louisiana, but to speak in sort of a general 50-state way, what is supposed to happen when someone is clearly not adhering to the treatment that has been ordered by the court and good faith efforts have been made by their case management folks and their treatment providers to solicit that adherence to treatment, and you reach the point where you got to let the judge know this isn't working. That facilitates a process where we now have to decide whether it is necessary to convert this court order from an outpatient order to an inpatient order, whether this person now needs to be hospitalized. And we don't know whether that's the case. It's going to depend on whether they are currently a danger to themselves or others. But because of their history of becoming so dangerous when they don't follow their treatment plan, that's going to require us to bring that person in for a short-term evaluation to see what their current status is and bring us all back before the judge for this modification hearing to determine what to do next. So what non-adherence generally leads to is in letting the judge know. The judge issues an order to have the person picked up for evaluation. We all come back to court. And, you know, sometimes that's going to result in the person actually being turned right back into the community because it's found that they don't yet meet the dangerousness standard. They haven't moved far enough down the road, even though we may think it's inevitably that they're going there. But the idea here is that the person recognizes that something's happening that didn't happen before. Rather than us all wait around for them to demonstrate that they are dangerous to themselves or others by acting out in the community in some dramatic way, that often takes the form of a criminal act that now has them in the clutches of the criminal justice system, and there's not a whole lot we can do for them as a mental health system. Rather than wait for that, we're going to be proactive. We are going to respond to signs of non-adherence to treatment, and we are going to intervene a little bit earlier. We're going to bring them into it for an evaluation to assess their condition. We're going to reconnect them with that treatment team to talk about, hey, what's going wrong? Remember, you have an obligation to the court. This is something you need to take really seriously. We're going to bring them back again before the judge to be reminded of the fact that they have an obligation to the court. And that alone, that process, again, we're just talking now about theory, and we'll look again at some of the data to see on whether it actually works when properly implemented. The idea is that that process sends enough of a signal to a person that things are not the way they had been for me before, and that this is something that I need to take seriously. Oh, sorry, I went a little bit too far ahead. So another point we should make is that we're going to talk a lot today about AOT programs. And when you look at Nicola's Law, or really any state's AOT law, you are not going to find any mention of AOT programs, one exception being New York. But for the most part, what you see is a legal mechanism that is on the books, a procedure that the law allows you to go through for a particular individual who is in need of this intervention in their lives, that you can use on a case-by-case basis, but nothing suggesting that in a community or in a county mental health system, you should have a program set up to specifically make use of this power. So establishing an AOT program, which we feel is something that ought to exist in every community in the country, is something that it may not be mandated by the law, and that's why so many of these laws are going unused, to our great frustration. But it's incumbent upon you as a system to use this power you have in a programmatic way, right? And what do we mean by that? We mean an organized practice of the local mental health system to develop a system to identify everyone in your community who stands to benefit from this type of intervention, right? Who seems to be stuck in the revolving door? The people who your CIT officers are making calls to, are responding to calls at their houses again and again, who are getting hospitalized again and again, who are showing up in jails again and again for offenses that are clearly the result of their inability to adhere to mental health treatment. A system that says when we identify an individual as being in need of AOT and meeting our state criteria for AOT, we are going to make sure we get that person into AOT. And you build an infrastructure around that resolve, right, where you have a specialized court docket, a particular judge who hears these cases on this docket and sees these individuals regularly through status hearings, ideally. And, of course, the other half of that is that there is a treatment system set up to deal with the particular special needs of folks who are in this situation, to make sure that there are decent services available for them to actually succeed in the community, to take swift corrective action when it becomes apparent that somebody is not following their treatment plan, and to make a decision at the end of that person's court order, because these are not indefinite in length. They have a specific period after which they expire. But the law allows you to renew that if this person is still in need of it. So an AOT program systematically evaluates people who are about to have their AOT order expire to make a clinical decision as to whether this person is now ready to graduate from the program and stay connected to all these services we've offered them on a voluntary basis, or whether this person still seems to need that help from the court to stick with it. Another important distinction to draw here is between AOT and a concept that it's often confused with, which is mental health court. I imagine you've got a bunch of these up and running, right, in Louisiana. Mental health courts are terrific. They are another really important tool in the toolkit that every community should have, but they are criminal courts. They are for folks who have committed offenses, usually nonviolent offenses, that are clearly the result of their inability to engage with treatment, and we are trying to divert these individuals from the criminal justice system that they are now in the clutches of, trying to give them an opportunity to follow a treatment plan in the community as a way of having their criminal charges for the time being set aside and hopefully in the end dismissed when they successfully complete their period of treatment. And that's a terrific thing, and it's something you absolutely ought to have in conjunction with AOT. But let's never make the mistake of thinking that the fact that you have a good mental health court in a community means that you don't need an AOT program as well, right? AOT is a civil process. It does not require the commission of a crime as the price of admission. And so there are many individuals in your community, just because severe mental illness, when untreated, it manifests in lots of different ways, right? There are many folks who stand to benefit from this kind of help who are never going to wind up in mental health court because they're not going to commit crimes. We don't want to write them off. And we don't, even for those who might be inclined to commit crimes at some point, we don't want to have to wait for that to happen and wait for someone to be victimized and hope that the crime they commit is not so severe that they're not even eligible for mental health court. That makes no sense. So what we want to have is these two systems existing concurrently, right? A mental health court for people who are in the clutches of the criminal justice system, and an AOT court apart from that in your civil system to prevent people from hopefully ever reaching the point where they need to be in mental health court. The biggest difference is between these two, of course, that in mental health court there is a real sanction. We've talked about the fact that there's no punishment attached to violating an AOT court order. In mental health court, of course, you actually do have teeth, because those criminal charges that have been set aside for the person to participate in the program, you're basically hanging over their head the whole time, and the person is made to understand that if this doesn't work out, we're going to have to bring those criminal charges back and prosecute you. So people have a really natural incentive built in to adhere to that particular program because they don't want to go to jail. We don't have the luxury of that with AOT. This is much more reliant on the persuasive power of the judge, the charisma, the compassion, the motivational power of the judge, although having a judge who has those qualities really helps in mental health court too, no question about it. But in AOT, that stuff looms even larger because it's really all we've got. And of course, the other major difference between these two programs is that mental health court at the end of the day really is a voluntary program. A person is being told, it's your choice. You can face your charges, roll the dice, see if you can beat the rap, or you can choose to participate in this particular program and avoid prosecution for now and hopefully altogether. But at the end of the day, it's that person who's deciding whether they want to participate in the mental health court program or take their chances on being prosecuted and hopefully wind up free to make whatever choice they want in the end. We're not giving people that option in AOT. We are basically saying that we have determined that you meet these criteria and this is a program that is going to benefit you. We're here to help you and we're going to make this available to you, but it's not for a person to decide, no, I don't think this is something I want to do. Which is not to say that AOT is only for people who at this particular moment in time are refusing to be treated. In fact, the optimal time to use AOT is when a person is upon hospital discharge. If you look at most AOT programs that are successful around the country, most of the patients are not coming directly from the community. They are coming from an inpatient hospitalization, and AOT is being used as a discharge tool at the point where they have been stabilized. And at that moment, they very often have a tenuous grasp on insight. Right? Insight is often something that comes and goes. And they may actually be saying, yeah, I want to engage in treatment. I want to do things to go better for me this time. I don't want to wind up back in the hospital. And so there may be a natural inclination to say, well, this person is with us. We don't need to put them under a court order to take part in something that they're willing to take part in on their own. It would be a tragedy to approach AOT that way because what we're looking here for is folks who have a history of maybe having those good intentions when they come out of the hospital, but having trouble hanging on to that intent, right? So the criteria for AOT are not focused on the person's current state of mind, current condition, the way inpatient commitment is. Instead, they are focused on a person's history of what happens to them in the community as a way of predicting what is likely to happen to this individual 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now when things are going great and they're feeling a little euphoric and they start to tell themselves, hey, maybe I don't actually need these meds, because we've all seen that cycle repeated again and again. So we are trying to get in front of that decision. And if you can place a person under this court order at that moment when they have good intentions and are embracing it, all the better. But don't think of this strictly in terms of something we have to do for people who don't want to be in the program voluntarily. Now, if you have that situation, that is not to say there is a need to have a contested court hearing. There isn't, because you have a person who is very often willing to voluntarily sign a settlement agreement, and so there are no facts in dispute. There is nothing for a judge to have to adjudicate in a hearing. And so it is fine to bring people into an AOT program through the signing of a voluntary settlement agreement. But here's a point to keep in mind about that. We put the word voluntary in quotes, right? Because the person understands that if they say no, they don't want to settle this case and agree to be part of the program, that it's going to result in you bringing a petition and imposing it through an involuntary court process. So with that understanding in the person's mind, there is sort of an element of coercion here. There's no question about that. So, we ought to take with a grain of salt that when we talk about patients in this situation who sign agreements, who sign settlements as voluntary. But here's the key thing. The black robe effect is still the main thing we're relying on here. So whereas in other legal contexts, when you settle a case, right, there is no reason to trouble a judge with it. You know, you might let the judge know that this case that we filed has been settled and, you know, can therefore go away. But there is generally not a need to bring a person before the judge to have any kind of interaction when you're settling a case. Here, that interaction with the judge is the secret sauce. It's what this program is all about. So you need to design an AOT program such that the folks who are signing voluntary settlement agreements are still seeing the judge in the same way people who have contested hearings do. But of course, there's no adversarial element to that interaction with the judge. The person is basically being congratulated on the fact that they have agreed to be part of this program, told by the judge that all these people are arrayed around the table here are here to help you. We're here to help you. I'm here to help you. We have expectations of you, and we're going to continue to see you periodically to make sure things are going well. Right? That black robe effect should be for everybody, not just the people who want to contest their petition. And of course, these periodic status conferences I've been referring to a little bit are the way that we reinforce this black robe effect. We want to make sure a person understands that in a couple of weeks I'm going to have to see the judge again, and the periods between these appearances can grow further and further apart as you go through the length of the court order, and the person is doing well under it. They don't have to see the judge quite as often, but there should always be an understanding in the person's mind that I'm going to have to see the judge again at some certain date, and that inspires the person to think in terms of wanting to have good things to tell the judge and have that experience be positive, and they get positive reinforcement from it and get praised by the judge for how well things are going. That's really what we are mainly relying upon in terms of how we're trying to motivate people. And of course, this reinforcement of the black robe effect has an impact on the treatment system too. Providers also know that the judge is going to expect that things have been going well on their end as well. And you don't want to design a system where you are only going back before the judge when things go wrong. I am already over time, so I think I'm going to try and bring some of the material I have for the rest of this presentation into my later segment. And what are we doing next? I don't have my agenda with me. Sorry. Yeah, okay, we'll take a 15-minute break at this point. So if we can resume at 10:05. And we'll, by the way, if anything I've said so far is raising questions in your mind, please know we're going to have lots of time to address those. So thanks a lot for your attention. I'll see you in a little while.